In this video lecture, we'll next take a look at how to set up and use variables in our programs. Okay, let's get started. So now that we know what variables are and what data types they may be, how do we go about setting up and using variables in our programs? The first thing we need to know is that all variables must be declared before they can be used. Declaration simply instructs the compiler how to store a variable in memory, how much space it needs, and the format in which to store the data, such as an integer or a floating point format. If we try to use a variable later in our program, but it hasn't been declared first, this will result in a compiler error. The general form of declaring a variable is simply to specify its data type and its variable name, terminated by a semicolon, because these are executable Java statements. If we need a number of variables of the same data type, we can also put them in a comma-separated list after their common data type, as shown here. Just make sure to leave a semicolon at the end. By good programming practice, we should try to group all of our variable declarations near the beginning of our code, at the top of any class or method. It's a bit sloppy to declare new variables on the fly as we decide we need them in our code, although there are situations in which this can't be helped. Nevertheless, in this course, I will expect you to group all of your variable declarations near the top of your code. And also, realize that we can declare a variable independently of setting its value. All the declaration does is set aside a named element of memory for upcoming use. Let's see some examples of this. Here are some examples of simple variable declarations. You'll find these examples in the file variableexamples.java on Canvas, but we'll just examine a few lines here. By the way, I do suggest that you download these example files from Canvas and open them in JGrasp so you can better follow along in these lectures. This will be among the first of many such examples we'll examine. Hit the pause button as often as you need to so you can do that. Notice that there's nothing complicated about these declarations. Each line declares one variable of the indicated data type, but note that each variable's value is as yet undefined. Notice also that each of the data types appears in JGrasp in purple text, which just means that they are Java reserved words, which we mentioned before. Each of the variable names appears in black and are Java identifiers, which again means that they are user-specified labels. The next step in using a variable is to initialize it, which means to assign it some starting value. Even if we've already declared a variable, we still can't use it until it gets some value, because it has no value by default. If we try to use an uninitialized variable in our code, even if it's declared already, we'll still get a compiler error. Here are the general forms of the syntax for initializing a variable. Notice that none of these statements contain any data type. That's because the variable names on the left-hand side are already declared in some previous step. Notice that there are a couple different ways of initializing a variable. We can assign it some specific value, or we can assign it the value of some other existing variable, or we can use some other full-blown Java expression on the right-hand side. We'll see some examples of this shortly. If we already know the value of a variable, we can initialize it near the beginning of our program. Otherwise, if we don't know its value ahead of time, that variable will get initialized somewhere downstream during the program's execution. Let's take a look at some examples. Here are some more examples of some variable initializations, also taken from the same file as before if you'd like to take another look in JGrasp. In this example, all the same variables which were declared in the previous example are now initialized by having assigned to them some type-specific values. For example, the sales tax rate and yearly salary variables are of floating point types, so they can be assigned numbers with decimals. Notice that here we do not repeat the data type specifications because we've already declared all these variables in the previous step. Notice also a couple of special termination characters for the long and float data types, a capital L and a capital F. All of the values on the right-hand side are called literals, which we'll get to a bit later. But when we specify a float or a long literal value, We also have to append the indicated special characters. This can be a bit of a pain, and for this reason we sometimes find it more convenient to dispense with float and long data types and instead use double and int data types exclusively. We've just seen that variable declaration and variable initialization can be separate operations. As it turns out, if we already know the value of a variable up front, it's often more convenient and perhaps more typical to just combine variable declaration and initialization into the same statement. Here are the general forms of such statements. All we're doing is combining two distinct operations into one statement. Again, this would typically be done at the beginning of any class or method in our program. If we already know the starting value, just set the variable to it up front. Let's look at some examples of this. Here are some examples of variable declaration and initialization combined into one expression. These are again taken from the same file if you'd like to download the example and take another look in JGrasp. These are the same variables that we previously declared and initialized in separate statements. Now each one of these statements shows the three properties of a variable: its name, its data type, and its value, all in one compact statement. If we already know a variable's value, this is usually the most convenient way to go.